Hello, you're watching Building a Web App using ASP.NET Core 1.0, Aurelia, TypeScript, and Webpack in Visual Studio Code, Section 1 of Part 5. I am Raja Mani. I live in San Jose, California. I am very passionate about technologies. I blog at opensource.netter.blogspot.com. And this video that you're watching is complementing Part 5 of the blog post in my blog. I tweet at Raja Jansi where I post updates on whenever I post a new video or post a new blog post. Prerequisites for this section are you should have watched the parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 that are in my YouTube channel, and you should have the source code for parts 4 and 5 downloaded from my GitHub link. You should also download the Aurelia skeleton navigation source code. What are we going to see in this section of part 5? There are some important releases since I posted part 4, so we'll go over them briefly and so that we can update our development environment to match those new releases. What is the importance of a to-do MVC application in learning a JavaScript framework? How do I prepare part 5 source code from the skeleton navigation and from part 4 source code? Let's talk about building the application layout, also known as the shell of our modern web application. Let's talk about setting up the project structure, which is very important for large-scale web applications. And how do I create the CSS styles and helper classes? Although this course is not about any particular CSS framework or not going to demonstrate how to create CSS styles, it's always good to know how did I make this user interface look cool with the CSS style sheets and frameworks out there. What is Aurelia templating and Aurelia binding within templating, and how important is it to build an application? What is HTML only custom element? For example, we're going to build a nav bar HTML only custom element, and we're going to use the bindable syntax to bind it to a property in a view model. What is Aurelia global resources and features? It's funny that a name of a feature is also feature. How do I set up the client router so I can navigate to different sections of my application using client-side routing? Aurelia comes up with a powerful client-side router just like any other JavaScript framework. Building the contact manager mini SPA. SPA is an acronym for single page application. And like I said, in the modern application that we're going to build, I'm going to have two mini spas. One is a contact manager and another one is a task manager. Both of them are heavily influenced by Outlook Web Access. And the contact manager tutorial is available in Aurelia's documentation page. They call it Doc Hub. The Doc Hub's contact manager talks about how to build the contact manager using the ECMAScript as well as TypeScript, but using the Aurelia's newest client interface, command line interface. It's called CLI. But what we are going to do is we're going to build it using Webpack and the Aurelia skeleton navigation application from the ground up. It also has more features, and we'll also build a backend in ASP.NET Core Web API in the next section. Power of dependency injection. Dependency injection is a very powerful object-oriented concept that will allow us to develop loosely coupled components. We'll talk about out-of-the-box Aurelia's DI container. And finally, towards the end, we'll be creating a contact list component. The user interface is going to have two panes. I'll show all of them when we develop it. And we are only going to be focusing on developing the left side pane where we'll see a list of components. Now let's dive right into the demo. But before we go into the demo, I just wanted to expand on all these little one-liners that I was explaining. Okay, so now let us talk about the items that we quickly went over in the introduction. What are some of the important releases since the last part? Aurelia 1.0 is now in RTM. You can download and you can read about the release notes by clicking on the link here. And Visual Studio Code, all along we've been using version 1.4. Now it's 1.5.1, and it now supports TypeScript 2.0 RC. If you look at the previous parts of this screencast, we were using TypeScript 2.0 nightly build. Now we could we could start using the stable version, which is release candidate RC. So you would install TypeScript by using these two commands: npm install -g TypeScript at RC, which is the version number. We are going to say release candidate. And then it's always a good idea to include the TS linter, which is used for static analysis of TypeScript code. Since you'll be using Visual Studio Code, you would want to install this TS linter locally, so the Visual Studio Code will leverage this linter. Then, what is the importance of to-do MVC application? Why did I bring it up even in this presentation? It's a great website. The URL of the website is todomvc.com. About 7 developers have put together this to-do MVC sample application in pretty much all popular JavaScript frameworks out there in the market now. If you want to learn anything, any new JavaScript framework, this would be the place to go to. So you can download the to-do MVC application on that framework that you're interested in. Say, for example, you wanted to learn how to build a to-do MVC application in Aurelia. There is an Aurelia version of to-do MVC application as well. You can download that and you can understand how to quickly get up to speed in a framework. But that alone is not enough. But that's a good starting point. Then you will have to go into the documentation of a framework. You should know the other critical and important concepts of a framework to build a production quality application. Nevertheless, this is a great resource. Please check it out. And we are not going to build our applications using any of the source code in this site. How do I prepare my part 5 source code, and why do I have to do this all over again? If you remember, in the previous parts, we had taken the skeleton navigation application that was using Aurelia 1.2 RC. Now that Aurelia 1.2 RTM is released, we have to again update our package.json to make it point to the 1.0 libraries. I'm not going to do that manually. Since we didn't do much of additional coding, or we didn't do any extra, we didn't bring any extra libraries, it's very easy for me to create this from scratch using the latest skeleton navigation source code, which would already have the webpack config.js updated and also the package.json updated to point to the Aurelia 1.0 RTM libraries. So it's easier for me. And then once I bring that skeleton navigation code, it'll be easy for me to bring the part 4 source code, my greeter component, and then I will integrate these two and delete the unwanted navigation source code so I could have a good, clean starting application for part 5. And that's what we're going to do now. And this screen just shows what all folders I need to exclude, which you already know. And similarly, what folders I need to exclude when I copy my part 4 source code. Okay, then now let us go into the folders and we'll start copying the required files from skeleton navigation project and part 4 source code to create the baseline for part 5. Okay, I will bring my part 5 modern folder, which is empty. And then on the right side, I already have the skeleton TypeScript Webpack ready. So I'm going to select all and I will exclude the ones that I don't need. So that way it's easier for me to only bring the files that I only bring the files and folders that I want. Okay, so let me do a right click, drag and drop. And then copy here. Okay, so now I got the required files and folders from my skeleton navigation. Now I'm going to jump into part 4 and I'll copy only the files that I need. Let me copy that part URL or the file path, change it to part 4. In here, we're going to omit a lot of files. So I'll select all. I really don't need par AW cache. I don't need the bin. I don't need the custom typings. I will exclude obj. I will exclude source, styles, test. I really don't need the favorite icon, index.html, index.js, package.json. I don't need them because the whole idea of doing this merging is to get the latest and greatest package.json from the skeleton application, not the one from my part 4. And then I am also going to exclude tsconfig.json. I don't need the project lock .json. I don't need the Webpack config. Okay. Now when I drag and drop, I think it'll complain about two files that needs to be overwritten, which is okay with me. Okay, so let it copy. That's a lot of files to copy. Okay, let's wait for this to get copied. So let me pause the video. Okay, like I said, it's going to ask me to override two files and let me decide for each file. I'm okay to override .gitignore and I'm also okay to override readme.md. Cool. Now that completes the merging of these two different project source code into my baseline. Okay, now that I've done this, let me open up Visual Studio Code. And as always, I'll open up my commander. I'm going to have two tabs open where the first tab will be used for all my command line operations and second tab will be used for running the application. So in the first tab, I'm going to type code dot to open Visual Studio Code. And I'll bring it up. Let's maximize this and zoom it a little bit. And what we're going to do now is we're going to exclude, we can let it restore so that the server side assemblies can be restored. While it's doing that, I'm going to go into project.json. And remember, we're getting some compiler errors about the Selenium ASPX files that we're using the old version of ASP.NET. So I'm going to exclude that by using the compile property. And there is an exclude property underneath that. It's an array property. And all that it takes is the folders that you want to exclude. So if I do that, then I won't get that compiler error when I try to run my ASP.NET Core application. Okay, that's on the server side of it. Once the restore is completed now, so I should be able to hit F5, and when I hit F5, I should be able to see my home index page, which is just a hello world message. So let me hit F5. It's going to launch Chrome, and then we're going to see the hello world message. And then what we'll do is we'll check if our API controller is still working. Okay, cool. I'm going to type /API/greetings to make sure that I get the JSON message back. Looks good. So now let's get the client side running. When we run the client side, all that we're going to see is the standard Aurelia navigation application. So in order for us to do that, we need to do npm install, which will bring all the Aurelia 1.0 libraries and all the other dependent libraries that are mentioned in my package.json. This might take around 2.5 to 3 minutes depending on your internet speed. So what I'm going to do is I'll hit enter and I'll pause my video because we don't have to sit and watch the npm downloading all the packages. Okay, so we got all those dependencies downloaded. So let's go back to the second tab and run my application by typing npm start. This time it should start at port 9000 and bundle it properly, and you should see an OK status. Once we get the OK status, we'll go and launch the application in Chrome. Let's have it handy. As soon as this is OK, yep, it says the bundle is now valid. Let me open up another tab and then let's hit localhost 9000 and we can have the developer tools open so we can see if there are any errors. It should just bring up the standard navigation application. Okay, so we can see that it has 3 menus, which is the standard application. So now what we're going to do is we're going to remove the unwanted files and we are going to wire our greeter component. In order for us to do that, we should bring the greeter view model and greeter view from part 4. Okay, so let's go into our application folder and then we'll copy just those two files, the greeter.html and greeter.ts. Let's right click, drag and drop, and we'll copy it here. Okay, so now let's go into Visual Studio Code. Let's maximize this and we'll go into the the startup file, which is main.ts. And there we have set the root component as app. We're going to change that to go to our greeter component. As soon as we save this, you can see that auto refresh will work and we'll see our greeter component, and we can say hello there, and you can see that that two-way binding works. So now we've set up the baseline project for part 5. So this is what we've done so far. We will see, we want to clean up now. We've copied the greeter component. This step is completed. We are done with this. Now we're going to remove the unwanted skeleton navigation source code so we can have a clean baseline. Okay, so let's go back into Visual Studio Code again, and we will start cleaning up the unwanted files. So I really don't need anything besides the greeter.html, greeter.ts, and main.ts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete them one by one. I left navbar because we will need the navbar because we are going to require the top menu. It's going to show our mini spas like the contact manager and task manager. So either you can delete it now and you can copy, bring it back later, or I can leave it now. So this is good now. This wouldn't have affected our application because our bootstrap code is pointing to greeter now. So it doesn't matter whether we delete all the other view models in the folder. Okay, with that said, let us start building the application layout, also known as the shell for our modern web application. The contact manager mini spa, this is how it's going to look after we completed the source code. So in here, what I want to do is I want to make a couple of comments here. So the left-hand side pane, the one that you're seeing here, this is what I call as contact list, and this is the contact detail. And in this section, we are only going to focus on building this left-hand side pane. And even there, what I think is we can only spend time on building this list first. Then we will spend some time on building the search component. If time permits, we will talk about how to implement remove contact and new contact. If not, we'll do it in the next section when we talk about the implementation of the actual contact details pane, which is on the right side. Okay. Like I said, the final application after we finish all the sections of this video or the tutorial would be that you would have two mini spas, contact manager and task manager. And this is how task manager will look after we've completed the application. Setting up the project structure, let us talk about the project structure, how I'm going to organize it so that we can see how you can put together your view models, your other artifacts in a good looking project structure. Let's go over what each and every folder is all about. As you can see, we have a common folder. That's what we want to start with, and that contains some helper classes. We'll figure out what helper classes we want to put later. And then, as you can see, the contact manager mini spa gets its own folder because all the mini spas are going to be in their own folders because they'll have a lot of components like view models and views and so on. Similarly, we'll have the task manager in its own folder. And then the next folder is very interesting. It's called a resources folder. And underneath that, you're seeing attributes, binding behaviors, dialogues, elements, messages, value converters, and a file named index.ts. So what is so special about this folder? This is where we're going to group all of our components. Like for example, Aurelia has so many concepts like custom attributes, binding behaviors, custom elements, value converters, and so on. These are all different features of Aurelia that are going to be helpful in building a complex web application. Other than that, we can also put together our own user interface elements like dialog boxes. Dialog box is also going to have a view model and its own view. So pretty much in Aurelia, when you look at it, it's going to be every feature will have a view model and a view, and some of them will have only view models and not views, while the others will have views but not the view model. But in general, if you understand this view model and view concept, pretty much you can build any of the Aurelia features like custom elements, custom attributes, and so on. So these resources folder introduces two important concepts in Aurelia named global resources and features. I will talk about them in the next slides. We'll go in detail about those two features. Let's pay attention to the next folder. It's called services. As the name implies, it can either be a client-side service or it can be a wrapper to a backend REST API. The next folder is shell, like we talked about in the previous slides. This is the folder that contains the main layout, or how also called as a shell. It's going to show where would I put my navigation items like the top menu bars, where would I put my view, and where would I put my list view, where would I put my detail view, and so on. So it basically gives the structure of the layout of the entire application, the UI layout of the entire application. And then the other file is main.ts, which you already know, which is the entry point. That's where we wired our greeter component now. And then the styles folder, as the name implies, is going to have the CSS and its associated artifacts. And test is the unit test folder, and typings is where the TypeScript typings will be stored. That's the d.ts files. Okay. So how did I come up with this project structure? I looked at three different places. The first one that's very interesting is the new Aurelia command line interface tool. It's called AU. And what I did was I ran the command AU new to create a new project. And when you create a new project using this Aurelia command line interface, it'll give you this nice resources folder, and underneath that you'll have the attributes, the elements, value converters with the index.ts file. I'll explain the importance of index.ts shortly. But for now, if you really wanted to play with the command line, you can always do that. Say, for example, you can open up the commander, and then what you could do is you could just go into a folder. Like, for example, I want to go into a temp folder, and then you could type AU new, and it's going to ask you a few questions. I want to name the application as Aurelia-app, but if you want to call it something else like Hello World, you can type the name. And then it gives you choices of languages, and I'm going to choose two. If you don't choose anything, whatever is in the default will be taken if you hit enter. But now I want to do a TypeScript application, and then it's asking me, hey, would you like to create the project structure based on your selection? I'm going to say yes. And then finally, it's asking me, would you like to install the project dependencies? If you say yes, what it does is it goes to the Node package manager and downloads all the dependencies. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just press Control C here, because I already ran this this command line tool and I created the Aurelia app. So what I wanted to show is if you go there, as you can see under the source, you can see that resources folder. And if you go in there, it gives me the other structure. If you look at most of them, they'll all be empty. So what I'll do is I'll just go back and open up this project in Visual Studio Code, so you can see it yourself. That's only giving a simple Hello World application, and most of the folders are going to be empty as well. So I'm going to just bring that up and zoom it up a little bit. As you can see, like I said, empty folders, but there is an index.ts file. I'll explain what is the importance of this when I talk about the global resources and features. So what I want to do is we can spend some time talking about the other project templates. One of the popular project templates that I've used in the past is John Papa's Hot Towel Angular template. Even though that's an Angular project, it still gives me some nice ideas about how can I organize my features, where would I put my common code, where would I put my data layer, abstractions, and so on. So that's another good one to look at. And also a community member named Bezad Abazi has tried to model an Aurelia template based off of John Papa's hot towel. He called it hot water Aurelia template, and you can click on the link. But I think that was done like a year ago. I'm not sure if he's actually maintaining that or not. So for now, what I did was I went with the Aurelia client interface, and I took some of the good concepts from Hot Towel Angular and Hot Water. Most of them are very self-explanatory. So it's common sense that whenever you want to add a new feature, always give it a folder where you can put its own view and components and so on. And Aurelia's Global resource and feature also allows us to organize some things very neatly, which I'll explain shortly. First thing first, how do I create the good looking user interface? So what I did was I downloaded the Bootstrap flat theme because Bootstrap is a very popular CSS framework from Twitter, and there are so many themes available out there using the Bootstrap styles. So I went with the flat theme, and when after I downloaded it, I figured out that the checkbox is not really flat. So I talked to my friend Bogdan Urs, who is a CSS expert, and he suggested this awesome Bootstrap checkbox. So I downloaded that style sheet after that. And then I was looking for some cool looking search bar. So I did some search in Google, and then I found this beautiful snippet in the CodePen, and I took that and I customized it. Then I also wrote some of my own custom styles, which I always put them in styles.css, which is the recommended practice by the Aurelia's command line interfaces project structure. So these are the four CSS files, out of which the first three are directly downloaded, and the last one has a custom styles that I want to use in my application. Okay, so let's see how I could import those CSS files into my entry point. If you look at the main.ts file, if you when you bring the Aurelia skeleton navigation, it would have already included the styles.css, the font awesome, and bootstrap, and that's where it stops. So what I did was I downloaded these three CSS files, and then I put them in the styles folder, and then I just imported them. Okay, so let us do that now. Um, you have a choice. You could either go into Google, or you can go into the links and you can download those CSS files. But I've already downloaded them and made them as part of my Part 5 source code. So what I would do is I would probably do copy the styles folder from my GitHub source code, which I already downloaded. Okay, so where's my completed source code? I have this from the GitHub. I downloaded it here. And here is my styles folder, and as you can see I have these four files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my styles folder here and copy this and right click, drag and drop, and overwrite the styles.css. I'll replace the files in destination. As soon as I replace, nothing is going to happen because I haven't wired these CSS files into my application yet. So what we'll do is we'll go into main.ts and we'll wire them. Let me close this Aurelia client command line interface generated sample application and bring my application that we were working on. Okay, so in the main.ts file, down below the Bootstrap CSS, we are going to include these three CSS files. I don't want to be typing this, so I'd copy it from the completed source code. So over here, and I'll paste this. Okay, and then as soon as you save this, you should see some change in the user interface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dock this to the left and bring my browser and dock it to the right so we can see if the styles change a little bit. Okay, so it's loading that. It looks a little flatter now. So, but to really see that in action, we should add some other styles like buttons and so on. So we'll see the Bootstrap flat style in action. But for now, if you don't get any errors, it shows that the style sheets are loaded without any issues. So that's good. Yeah, because I don't see any red error messages. So I'm going to just play with this. Okay, so looks good. Looks like the font has changed a little bit. Looks flatter now. Okay, so the next step is we'll talk about what is Aurelia templating now? Why is it important? And why are we doing this? Because we need to understand how to construct the navigation bar, how to construct the contact list component. Without understanding the Aurelia templating, it's going to be difficult for us to build anything in Aurelia. So let's talk about Aurelia templating. So what is Aurelia templating? It allows us to build complex applications. So if you remember, In the introduction to Aurelia, I told that Aurelia is built on top of the web component standard. And this template element, which is an HTML element, is a web component standards. And all it does is it allows you to define a HTML snippet or fragment that the browser will simply ignore. It is inactive or inert. So Aurelia takes that and then it gives life to that by rendering it. So that's that's very important. You need to have always surround your views with the template HTML element. Then the binding allows you to control the behavior. How I could, you know, bind the HTML attributes, the DOM events, and the element content using the Aurelia binding. The syntax is very straightforward. First, let us focus on how we can get the attributes to participate in binding. So you will use the syntax attribute dot command equals an expression. So an attribute can be an HTML attribute, like for example, it could be value attribute on a text box, it could be a href attribute on an anchor, and so on. You will use that attribute name dot a command. What are the possible commands? The commands that are possible are one time, which means that the view model to view, that kind of a binding will happen only once. One way is also going to happen from view model to view, but it'll happen every time. It's not just only once. The two-way is the most popular one, where the binding is both ways, from view model to view and from view to view model. But if you don't want to explicitly specify, for example, you want to say the value attribute with the command dot one time or dot one way or dot two way, you could always fall back onto the safe option, which is the bind option. If you just say the attribute dot bind, the decision is made automatic. That is, it'll be two-way for all the form controls and one way for almost pretty much everything else. So for example, if you have a div or if you have something else like an anchor, if you say href.bind, it'll kind of figure out whether it is going to be, in this case, one way makes more sense. So it'll choose one way. Whereas if you use a text box, it's a form element, and it makes more sense to use two-way. So if you know for sure, you can mention the one time, one way, two way yourself, or you should use dot bind and let Aurelia figure out automatically. That is the attribute side of the binding story. What do I do to bind to the DOM event? Like when I click a button, what should happen? How do I communicate that using Aurelia templating, Aurelia binding syntax? It's the same syntax. Instead of an attribute, here it'll be a DOM event dot command equals an expression. We'll go to the expression towards the end. What are the two possible commands? There are two. One is trigger. The other one is a delegate command. The events could be like a click event, could be double click event, could be focus event, and so on. Those are the standard DOM events. The only difference is you don't have to say on focus or on click. You remove the word on and you just say the name of the event dot the command, which is either trigger or delegate. If you use a trigger, that means it's going to attach that event handler directly to the element where you are declaring. For example, if you have a button tag, and then if you say button click.trigger equals, delete expression, the expression could be a JavaScript expression. And if you say call the delete function, that means the trigger is going to attach that event handler function directly onto that element, which is the button. Whereas a delegate attaches a single event to the document, not to the element, at the document level, and then it'll properly dispatch them back to the original target. Say for example, a classic example that people always use is an element that has some nested elements. Let's say, for example, an unordered list with li, or a table with trs and tds and so on. You don't want to be attaching a lot of dot trigger to every cell or every row or every li. Say for example, you use the delegate on all the child elements and then let them get wired at the top level, and then at the document, and then that the document dispatches based on where you clicked. That is the idea. So trigger is good when you want to directly target the element, and delegate is good if you want it to be dispatched at a higher level. So So use your best judgment whenever when you need a lot of lot of elements. You would rather use delegate so that the parent can the document can dispatch it to the children. But if you have a targeted event handling, always use trigger. And what is an expression? It's a JavaScript expression, and the only special thing is you can use a $event property to access the DOM event that, especially when you're binding using a DOM event, you can always pass a $event. So that property will contain the actual DOM event that is being triggered from the DOM. So that's about Aurelia templating. Let's jump into the HTML behavior. What is HTML behavior and why is it important? The HTML behavior in Aurelia allows you to extend HTML using custom attributes and custom elements. The Like I said, Aurelia is a conventions-based framework. So if you create a view model class and if you call it my list custom element or my list custom attribute, you are letting Aurelia know that, hey, this class or this view model is a custom element or a custom attribute. By default, if you don't use any convention, that is, if you just give just my list and if you don't give the suffix custom element or custom attribute, then pretty much every component is treated as a custom element. Say, for example, our greeter component, we didn't say greeter custom element or greeter custom attribute. We just named it greeter, but then Aurelia treated that as a custom element. So you could have technically used a HTML tag called greeter and /greeter, and it would still render that. That's how cool Aurelia is. Anything and everything is a component in Aurelia, and by default, if it cannot figure out what it is going to treat that as a custom element. So the difference between custom element and custom attribute, I think I made a mistake here. It should be custom attribute. Um, it's very easy. So I should have used custom attribute. Okay. The custom element requires both the view model and view, whereas a custom attribute only requires a view model. You don't need a view. The view models are always in Pascal case. In Pascal case, technically becomes kebab case. For example, my list custom element and or my list custom attribute becomes simply my list. So what it does is this part is only a convention, so it's going to remove that. So it's going to remove that, and then it's going to take the name of the view model, which is in Pascal case. Pascal case is also called as unit caps, where every word is capitalized, and it's going to turn them into kebab case. Kebab is the all lowercase, but every word is delimited with a dash or a hyphen. Okay, so that is how you define HTML behavior, which is done via custom attributes and elements. And how do let's say, for example, you defined a my list custom element. How do I bring it to my view? The way you do that is by using the require tag. This tag is implemented, it's a custom tag implemented by Aurelia. So this works with the Aurelia's view resource pipeline, which is a cool concept. So what it does is it allows you to bring in the custom elements or custom attributes into any view you want. You can just say require from, and you can say equals to the path of the custom element, and it'll bring the custom element into the view. One of the cool things about this require tag is it not only works with the Aurelia's custom attribute and custom elements, it also works with what is called as a HTML only custom element, which is a custom element. It only has a view, which is .html without any view model. You can bring that also into a view using the require from syntax. Also, you could bring any CSS. Say, for example, you want to bring your Bootstrap CSS. You could just say require from equals // node module / bootstrap.css. That'll bring the CSS as well. So that's why the view resource pipeline is very cool, and this require tag works well with that. So the important thing to remember here is if you in the path, you do not have to give the file extension. If you don't give the file extension, that means Aurelia will understand that it's a component. It could be a standard component without any convention, or it could be a custom element or a custom attribute. If you really want the component to function as a whole, you should not give the extension. But on the other hand, if you know for sure your custom element is only HTML only element which only has .html, then you can go ahead and give the .html extension. Or if it's a CSS, you always can give .css. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of concepts. So the recap is Aurelia templating. We can go back to that slide. So Aurelia templating allows us to build complex applications, and template tag is used for web components, and binding is the key. You could bind your HTML attributes. Also, you could bind your DOM events, and there are different kinds of bindings: one time, one way, two way bind, and there are two types of event commands, which is trigger and delegate. An expression is going to be a JavaScript expression, and the dollar event is a special property. Similarly, you can have HTML behaviors implemented using custom attributes and elements, and it's a convention-based framework. If it is not given any suffixes, or if it's not decorated with the with the special at decorators, it'll always fall back, or it'll always treat the component as a custom element. And the required tag is a very, very important tag. Okay, now that we've talked about the Aurelia templating, binding, and HTML behaviors, it is time for us to understand what is a global resource. Before we do that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go back into our project, and I want to bring those empty folders under resources from my sample application generated by the Aurelia client. You could either manually create the resources folder and all the subfolders, or you could copy that empty folders from the sample project created by the Aurelia command line interface, which is what I'm going to do. So let me go to my project, go into my source, and I will bring up the other folder. Like I said, I worked in temp folder. So I'm going to go into my temp folder. Oops. And then there is my Aurelia app, which is what I generated using the Aurelia CLI. I go into the source folder. I'll copy these resources and I will paste it over here. And now let's go into Visual Studio Code and we'll see that resources folder right there. Okay, so as you can see, it has an attributes, binding behaviors, elements, value converters. Each and every one of them are some important Aurelia features, which we'll explore in the later parts of the tutorial. But what is more important is this index.ts file. And if you remember, I mentioned that whenever you wanted to import a custom element or a custom attribute, you always have to say require from. If you have some common components that you want to frequently use in all of your views, it is very, very cumbersome, and it's very painful to type the require from statement every time. If you really don't want to do that, you could inform, or you could register your your feature or your component as a global resource using this config.global resources syntax. So if, let's say for example, I have a custom element and that's called my element, what I would do ideally is it's just an array, and I would just say, hey, in the same folder, because this is relative to where you're living. I'm in the resources folder, so I would simply say dot slash elements slash, assuming that I have a component named myList, I would just say this. Let's say I have another custom attribute that I wrote, and that is called my custom attribute. So what I'll do is I'll say slash attributes slash my dash custom. So this is how you register your global resources with Aurelia. One of the cool things is, like, now I have created my own configuration, which is inside my own folder, which is what I call as feature. Aurelia has this notion of feature. A feature is a way for you to group the related components. So the first thing you want to do is you want to publish those components as global resources, and then you can go into your entry point in main.ts, and you use Aurelia.use.feature and the name of the feature, which is going to be the name of the folder. In our case, it's going to be resources. So you could, I'm going to go back to the index.ts because these are non-existent elements. It's going to look for them and throw an error. So I'm going to just delete them, save this guy, and then I will go and save this. This will do nothing because at this point our feature, the resources feature, has nothing in there. So the application still runs without any errors. But later what we'll do is we'll start adding some custom elements. We'll add some HTML only custom element, and then we'll update this index.ts with our components one by one. Okay, so we talked about global resources, just as how we use the import statement for the view models. You to bring a model, you use the import syntax. Similarly, to bring a view or a custom component, you'll use the require from syntax. So for view model, you remember that it is going to be import. For view, it's always going to be require from. Okay, so if you want to define your frequently used components, like I already said, you can register them as global resources, and this is the syntax for that. Okay, and features, I already went over this briefly. So first thing is you need to create a folder, then you need to put all the related components and other source code under that folder. Then you'll create a file named index.ts because we're using TypeScript, but if you're using JavaScript, it'll be index.js. And then the file should export a configure method, which is right here. And that we will call this configure dot global resources, where I put a loading indicator element, a custom element, a date picker custom element, a dialog box, a message box element, and the value converter. These are things that we'll be building eventually in part 6 of the video. Just to give you an idea, we are grouping all of our elements and registering them as global resources, and since they are all in the folder which is called resources folder, what we need to do is we need to call the Aurelia.use feature, which is in our case called resources, because that's the name of the folder. This is how you turn on the feature using the Aurelia.use feature. So if you do not want to use global resources and features, you are welcome to type require from everywhere, but that's going to be, over a period of time, it's going to get complex. I would rather use the feature and global resources so I can organize my code better. I already talked about Aurelia new, and we saw a brief demo of that as well. So next important concept is setting up the client router in our view model. So let us talk about how we want the entry point class, which is main.ts. I want that to load my application shell. Right now it is loading the greeter component, which is simply a message. It displays a message, and also it gives you a small text box where when you type something in the text box, the message also changes because they're all bound to the same view model property. That was good for a demo, but that is not helpful for a real application. So it's time for us to start building our shell. Let us go ahead and build it.